Now, I want to turn to some interesting stories in residential tenancies, and there have been a bunch of them in the news lately. For example, Karima, there was a situation reported by CBC in London where a student at Western University had signed a lease, and the lease included some shared space in the landlord's home. When the tenant arrived, the landlord saw that she had some tattoos and told her, "I'm changing my mind. I'm not going to rent to you because your tattoos are too scary." So, what would you advise either the landlord or the tenant in a situation like that?
Well, I mean, the first thing is where there is a signed lease. Um, it's not really permissible to renege based on something as arbitrary as tattoos. What wasn't entirely clear from the story was whether the shared space meant that there was an exemption from the Residential Tenancies Act. Because where a landlord and tenant are sharing a kitchen and washroom, a different set of rules apply, and recourse would be through small claims court as opposed to the landlord tenant board. If in fact it is a proper residential tenancy situation, then the landlord's options for eviction are quite limited. And I can't really imagine a scenario where tattoos would justify. Short answer, if I'm the tenant, I'm going to be looking at what are my options for recourse, either to force this tenancy, or if I don't really want to live with this landlord, to at least be compensated out of pocket expenses. And as a landlord, I probably will in the future want to do better diligence to make sure I'm comfortable with the tenant I'm selecting.
Now, Dan, what's your view on this? What can a tenant do if their landlord is treating them unfairly or even discriminating against them? Certainly, tattoos is not the only reason someone might act in a discriminatory way. And does this type of thing happen in commercial contexts as well as residential ones?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, it's timely because this came up last year in a decision I wrote about called Elias Restaurant in Keogh Shepherd Plaza. And in that case, the tenant operated a Caribbean restaurant in a strip mall, and the landlord would not let them renew their lease, and they were ducking and dodging them. So the tenant applied for relief from the court, and in response, the landlord said, "No, we don't want them to renew their lease because we don't want them here anymore because they're an unsavory business, was like unsavory customers and clientele." And what the tenant argued was the landlord, whether it knew it or not, was displaying an attitude of anti-Black racism and were discriminating against him for that reason. And in deciding it, Justice Morgan agreed. And he didn't have to even look at that when making the decision because they were allowed to renew their lease. But he saw it in the evidence and saw it that way, saying, you can't just do that. You can't say you don't like the way people are and look and behave and refuse to renew a valid lease with them for that reason. So this case was seen as a very interesting development in a lot of ways because the court did not sidestep the issue at all. They kind of faced it head on and agreed with it. So it shows that tenants in the commercial space too will have some recourse from the courts if they do feel and they could show to a degree that they are being discriminated against in that manner.
Yeah, I read that case as well. It was a really interesting one because I think the court actually could have decided it on completely different issues because of certain
Mhm.
conduct of the landlord. But they did address this racism issue head on, which I found interesting. Um,
Mhm.
in the time we have left, Karima, I want to talk to you about a trend we're seeing with rental frauds, especially in the residential context. What can you tell me about some of these scam, fake listings, duplicate listings, and what you're seeing on the commercial or on the residential side?
I will say that scammers have adapted and capitalized on the pandemic, in particular, the fact that there's not as much face to face interaction. And so, behavior that would otherwise be a red flag, like let's just do this all virtually, is accepted as being normal. Everything ranging from people who aren't actually the landlord accepting money for rent, signing leases. I would say that that's the most major iteration of the scam. And I've also had situations where tenants are sending money to someone who they think is a lawyer, but it's not a real lawyer's address, and being duped out of their funds. So it is, it's a troubling context for sure.
It's certainly a lot easier to scam people these days in every context during this virtual world. We have to go to commercial, but we will be right back.